As we move into the Late Bronze Age 2 period, we begin to see far more Mycenaean influence even on Crete. Last episode, I left off with the steady decline and transformation of Minoan culture in the generation after the Thera eruption, and I explained how the ash clouds from the volcano could have destabilised agricultural production for the Cretans, thereby having a knock-on effect on their organisation and structure across the Aegean. In doing so, this allowed a new culture to emerge and fill the gap that was left. This culture was the Mycenaeans, primarily from the mainland Peloponnese. Now, before we get into analysing the Mycenaeans themselves, I want to revisit something that I mentioned last episode. Remember that guy Arthur Evans, the 20th century archaeologist who helped to define and reconstruct a large portion of Minoan culture for, better or worse? Well, during the 20th century, there was actually a fierce debate between Evans and certain other Mycenaean specialists over which culture, the Minoans or the Mycenaeans, really held claim to the title of progenitor of Greek civilization. This debate ended up creating what we can describe as really kind of a meaningless boundary between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, like there's some kind of contrast. In reality, it's not as simple. For Evans, as we saw, the Minoans were characterised as peaceful, largely egalitarian societies, since the palaces didn't have a centralised throne room, and they seemed to specialise in and ultimately spread through seafaring and peaceful maritime trade as far as he knew. They wrote in a kind of romantic lost language, which was Linear A, and they worshipped the bull as an image of fertility and strength, but nevertheless held a fundamentally matriarchal mother cult, probably to do with snakes or something, centred around Crete. On account of their frescoes and their murals that bedecked all the palaces, they were clearly superior, both artistically and culturally, as far as he was concerned. The Mycenaeans, on the other hand, were believed to be characteristically macho and warriors. In the later Mycenaean palaces, we find clear evidence of throne rooms in the centre, signalling a stricter hierarchy than what we saw with Minoans. For him, when he was interpreting them, they primarily spread through conquest and war over land, and they favoured the chariot and horse over peaceful boats and seafaring, and connections with nature and the sea animals. They wrote in Linear B, which was an inherently patriarchal language, potentially even having a male-centric cult. They were based on the Peloponnese and were clearly superior in war and conquest, oftentimes to the detriment of their cultural and artistic expression, which, as far as he was concerned, was simply stagnating and paling in comparison to the more beautiful Minoans. Now, while these ideas have become pretty firmly rooted in modern Western culture since the 20th century, they are completely wrong. These stereotypes are a product of culture-historic archaeological paradigms from the early days of archaeological theory, which often sought to characterise cultures as easy box-to-place styles, where with behaviours and certain ideas based on seriation, pottery durations, and all that kind of thing. In reality, a huge amount of these characteristics actually overlap and can be found in both cultures, and there is a strong degree of continuity. For example, this idea that the Minoans were entirely peaceful and not warriors is just plain wrong. Research carried out by Dr. Barry Molloy of the University of Sheffield's Department for Archaeology has shown that war was in fact a very defining characteristic of Minoan society, and that the warrior identity was one of the dominant expressions of male identity in general. Speaking to Science Daily, he pointed out that the study shows that the activities of warriors included such diverse things as public displays of bull leaping, boxing contests, wrestling, hunting, sparring, and even dueling. Ideologies of war are shown to have permeated religion, art, industry, politics, and trade, and most of the social practices surrounding martial traditions were demonstratively a structural part of how Minoan society evolved and how especially men saw themselves. Even for the later Mycenaeans, the supposed heroes of the Greek-Trojan War, thanks to Homer, they took up its weaponry and practices and even ideologies. He says in his interview that, in fact, it is to Crete that we must look for the origin of those weapons that were dominant in Europe even until the Middle Ages. namely swords, metal battle axes, shields, spears, and probably even armour. Molloy found an enormous amount of violence in the symbolic grammar and material remains from prehistoric Crete. Weapons and warrior culture were materialised variously in religious sanctuaries, graves, domestic units, and hoards, and could also be found in portable media intended for use during social interactions, administration, feasting, and even personal adornment. In fact, it actually seems like there were few spheres of interaction in Crete that didn't have a martial component to them, right down to the symbols used for writing in Linear A. Equally, on the other hand, this idea that the Mycenaeans just didn't have well-developed artistry is easily disprovable by examining the complex burial goods in shaft tombs at Mycenae, for example. When compared against new data, there really doesn't seem to have been a huge amount of difference between the Minoans and Mycenaeans. There is much more of a grey area in the middle that has been afforded over the last century. The idea that Linear B may in fact be a Mycenaean adaptation of Linear A might also help to explain the role of Crete in creating the Mycenaean culture as we understand it. Even Knossos is actually the first and earliest Mycenaean palace that we know of. It just never disappeared or stopped being inhabited in the Minoan-Mycenaean transition. It became, or at least adopted, Mycenaean traits much earlier than we see all the other palaces do in the Peloponnese. So to really begin understanding the Mycenaeans, we have to go back a little bit earlier, to what's known as the shaft grave period on the mainland. This corresponds roughly to around 1700 to 1500 BCE. This period corresponds to the time where Crete was at its peak under the Minoan culture. Back on the Greek mainland, in the Peloponnese, things are very different. We don't have any palaces here, at least not yet. However, there are some famous cemeteries, especially from Mycenae, that give us insight into the beginnings of Mycenaean culture. Importantly, there are 2 shaft graves, complete with wall enclosures, and they were discovered and, thankfully, unplundered and undisturbed, so they tell us a lot. The graves are called grave circles A and B, and they both have deep rectangular shafts above stone-walled burial chambers, and they lie in 2 circles. The first one, grave circle A, was excavated in 1876 by the classical archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, famous for also discovering Troy, and the other wasn't found until 1951, actually by accident, when workmen were digging nearby at a 13th century Tholos tomb known as the Tomb of Clytemnestra, when they accidentally stumbled on it. The following year, extensive excavations were carried out by archaeologists Ioannis Papadimitriou and Georgios Milonas. Of the 2 graves, A is clearly earlier and is noticeably richer in materials and grave goods. What we can tell from grave circle A is that at some point during the erection of the walls and the palace at Mycenae, they clearly made an effort to include the grave inside the tower walls, which raises some questions about how the people there were trying to cultivate a lived memory of the people inside it. The sheer quantity and nature of the burial goods in both of these graves tell us that something very different is going on culturally, economically, and probably also politically for the Mycenaeans. Interestingly, most of the tombs included in these shafts are actually grouped together, so they're either a group of elites or perhaps even a family. Many of the grave goods are very high quality, they're prestige wear, elite items, so it almost seems like these people are making a deliberate statement during a time period where things are progressing and changing very, very quickly. It'll take about another 200 years yet for the Mycenaean palaces to show up, so the question around what's going on here during this time is a big one for archaeologists right now. Among all the finds, we have the famous death mask of Agamemnon, which is actually much earlier than the Trojan War, which is in the late Bronze Age period, so it's not actually related to Agamemnon at all. There's also a beautifully carved rock crystal bowl here that you can see with a duck motif that is probably Egyptian in origin, which again testifies to some regional trade networks. There are the famous and beautiful bronze daggers, majorly from grave circle A, and they are inlaid with gold using a Syrian technique called nielo, which was probably done by a Cretan artist. One of the best preserved daggers actually has a hunting scene on it with lions inscribed, which interestingly is actually not a Cretan motif, even though the artist probably is. So again, there seems to be a huge deal of cultural exchange going on even outside of Greece, not just in the making of tools and sourcing of materials, but also in the trade of ideas and potentially myths. If we head west to the palace of Pylos, the supposed palace of Nestor, according to Homer, we have even more tombs that are similar to the circle graves at Mycenae, except they're more isolated. One particular grave is the so-called Griffin warrior, which was actually discovered fairly recently in 2015, about 10 years ago, which again is still about 200 years earlier than the actual palace there itself. So again, we're looking at a rich tomb with a lot of gold objects, but this one seems to have a lot more Cretan influence, with many of the prestige goods even being made by Cretans themselves and shipped across to the mainland. Among the burial goods here, we find a mix, again, of high-quality daggers, swords, offering cups, and ornate jewellery such as rings and signet seals. One notable example is a signet ring here with a bull leaping iconography. It's fairly typical of Cretan artistry. The huge quantity of weapons signals an interesting shift from Cretan culture though. Although the gold-coated blade on some of the swords would not have been practical in battle, so it may in fact be a sign of a deceased person wanting to appear as a warrior in death. Further, the presence of the combs here, personal hygiene items and mirrors also seems to imply that the concept of masculinity in Mycenaean culture was not entirely dependent on warfare or warriorhood, but also on how you present yourself and look in terms of your own body image. They seem to have had a very big focus on presentation, on personal hygiene, and what today we would call manicuring. Thinking more broadly, what we have going on here, both at Pylos and Mycenae, seems to be an elite culture that is expressing itself through grave goods 200 years before the palaces arise there. Interestingly, in the exact centres and locales in which they do. So one of the clearest examples of extreme high quality craftsmanship is this image here, which is known as the combat agate. This thing is incredible. It's a seal stone and it was found in the Griffin tomb, and it depicts two warriors engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a third warrior lying on the ground. The iconography on the left appears to be trying to depict a Cretan person based on the weapons, hairstyle and clothing. The person on the right is unclear to us, but it must have at least been known, at least in motif form, to the carver, based on the distinctive helmet and shield. This scene is not new, though. The motif on it here resembles one depicted on a gold cushioned seal from Grave Circle A in Mycenae, and it's also similar to some other late Bronze Age signets and seals, such as the Battle of the Glen gold signet from Shaft Grave 4. It seems like all of these objects are being modelled after some well-known prototype or myth, perhaps originally a wall painting or oral history. So we could be looking at a depiction here of a very early, well-known myth or narrative tale. Again, this is happening 200 to 300 years before the date of the Trojan War is supposed to have happened. So this of course raises questions about the nature of the Homeric and epic tradition that eventually culminates in Homer. Are we seeing here the beginning of a shared mythos? Now, bearing all this in mind, another thing I should say is that this agate is about 3.5 centimeters in diameter. That's about 1.3 inches for you Americans. Seriously, pause this video right now, go and get a ruler and measure 3.4 centimeters, and look at the sheer quality of this carving. The definition on the hair and the muscles and the clothing, how comfortable the artist is with the composition of a lying body fitting the shape of the gem. The level and quality of craftsmanship here, along with a grasp of potential mythic narrative, is outstanding, and it has been called the single best piece of glyphic art ever recovered in the Bronze Age Aegean. This kind of understanding of proportion and bodily depiction is unprecedented and doesn't show up again until the classical era in terms of sculpture. Thank you so much for watching, and we will continue looking at the tombs next week. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.